At my daughter and Appo's engagement party, 60 guests filled the lawn at Ashwood Farm, and somewhere between the second toast and the first slow dance, Claire came up behind me at the drinks table, put both hands around my arm the way she used to when she was 6 years old and afraid of the dark, and said very quietly, and quote, "Mom, get people toward the house. Call 911. And quote, for words and a number. No tremor in her voice. That was the part that told me she meant it. Claire has never once in her life raised an alarm she didn't, and Appo's already have 3 pieces of evidence for. I have spent 31 years on the federal bench learning to keep my face still while my mind runs, and I kept it still then while she turned, laughed at something a passing guest said, and walked back across the lawn to the man she had just agreed to marry. I want to tell you how we got to that lawn. I think you need the whole of it to understand why 4 words from my daughter were enough to make a retired judge start counting exits. My name is Margaret Calloway. I sat on the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Kentucky for 22 years before that, and 9 years as a state circuit judge before that, which means that by the time I retired I had spent more of my adult life watching people testify than doing almost anything else. You learn things sitting above a courtroom that you can and Appo's unlearn. You learn that guilt has a smell, not literally but close to it, a kind of over-preparedness, an answer that arrives too smoothly. You learn that the witnesses who are telling the truth stumble sometimes, correct themselves, admit they don't, and Appo's remember. The witnesses who are lying have already rehearsed the version of themselves they want you to believe, and rehearsal, however good, has a rhythm truth doesn't, and Appo's I thought that education would make me unfoolable. I was wrong, and it nearly cost me the only child I have left in the world. I live at Ashwood Farm, 410 acres in Woodford County, Kentucky, in the heart of the bluegrass, where the fences run white against green in a way that still, some mornings, makes me stop on the porch with my coffee and just look. My husband David and I bought the land the year we married, back when it was tobacco ground with 2 collapsing barns and no house worth the name. We built the breeding operation up together over 34 years, broodmares mostly, a handful of stakes winners we and Appo's still proud of, and a barn full of foals every spring that still make me feel, every single time, like something has been forgiven. David died in the fall of 2022, 19 months after his diagnosis. ALS. I remember the neurologist at the University of Kentucky sitting across from us with a box of tissues angled just slightly toward David and Appo's side of the desk, and I remember thinking, with the specific cruelty of a mind trained to notice details, that someone had positioned that box very deliberately, that this was not the first time he and Appo's delivered this particular sentence in this particular room. End quote. How long, end quote, David asked him, end quote, before I can and Appo's talk? End quote. The doctor didn't, and Appo's flinch, which I respected. End quote. Voice function typically goes early to mid-course. I and Appo's plan for 18 months to 2 years before speech becomes difficult, and earlier than that for it to become unreliable under stress or fatigue, end quote. David nodded like the man had told him a weather forecast. Then he turned to me and said, end quote, well, better say the important things now then before I have to spell them out on a board. End quote. That was David. He and Appo's been a large animal veterinarian for 4 decades, the kind of man farmers called at 3 in the morning because they trusted his hands more than they trusted their own instincts, and he met his own death the way he and Appo's met every difficult foaling I ever watched him work, steady, unhurried, more worried about everyone else in the room than himself. He kept working for another 5 months, driving out to farms with a hand tremor he explained away as, end quote, old age, end quote, to anyone who asked, until the day his voice caught in Wooden and Appo's let go and he had to pull over on Pisgah Pike and sit until it passed. He came home that evening and told me, without ceremony, that he was done seeing patients. He spent the next 14 months at Ashwood, in the chair by the west window where he could watch the foals in the paddock, and I spent them driving between the farm and every specialist in a 100-mile radius, learning the vocabulary of a disease that takes a man and Appo's body away from him one function at a time and leaves his mind entirely, cruelly intact. Our daughter Claire drove down from Lexington every weekend those last months. She and Appo's a large animal veterinarian too, followed her father into it so naturally that I don't and Appo's think either of them ever discussed it as a decision, and she and Appo's finish a full week of farm calls and then spend her Saturdays and Sundays at Ashwood, sitting with David, reading to him when the tremor made it too hard for him to hold a book himself, adjusting the tablet with the text-to-speech program he and Appos D started using in the last 2 months when his voice went entirely on what turned out to be his second-to-last good day, a Tuesday in late September, when for reasons no one could explain the disease seemed to loosen its grip on his throat for a few hours. David asked me to send Claire to the barn on an errand, and once we were alone he used what voice he had left to ask me for 2 things. End quote, the first one and Appos, easy end quote. He said, each word costing him visible effort. End quote, Don and Appos T sell the horses. Keep the operation running. Don and Appos T let this place go quiet just because I and Appos am not in it. End quote. End quote, I promise end quote I said. My own voice wasn't an Appos T steady, though his was the one that should have been. He nodded, satisfied, and rested for a moment before continuing. End quote. The second one is harder to say right, so let me get it out before I lose the words end quote. His eyes found mine and held them with an intensity that had nothing to do with the disease. End quote. You spent your whole career reading people who were under oath. Promise me you won and Appos T stop reading them just because they and Appos re not. End quote. End quote. David, what do you mean? End quote. End quote, I mean Claire. End quote. His hand trembling found mine. End quote, she and Appos S going to fall in love again someday. Good. She should. But she and Appos S going to be alone in the world after we and Appos re both gone with a farm and money behind her, and there are people who go looking for exactly that. Promise me you and Appos LL keep watching. Even when it feels unkind to watch. Especially then. End quote. I thought, God forgive me, I thought he meant something smaller. I thought he meant Claire and Appos S career, her tendency to overwork, maybe some worry about a boyfriend from her residency years he and Appos D never fully approved of. It made sense to me because I needed it to make sense. End quote, I promise end quote I said. End quote, good. End quote, he closed his eyes. End quote, good woman end quote. Those were nearly the last words he spoke clearly. He died 6 days later in the front room, with Claire on one side of the bed and me on the other, the October light coming low and gold through the west window exactly the way he and Appos D always liked it. In the 2 years since, I kept the first promise without difficulty. Ashwood kept running. Hollisbird, our farm manager of 11 years, made sure of that, and made sure, with the patient exasperation of a man who has forgotten more about horses than most people will ever know, that I learned the parts of the operation David had always handled without my really noticing. The second promise I turned over and over on the porch in the evenings, the way you turn a stone in your pocket, without ever quite finding its shape. I did not understand it. Not until the night Claire called me from Lexington with something in her voice I hadn't and Appos T heard from her in longer than I wanted to admit. Hope. It was a Tuesday in February, the quiet month at Ashwood, when the maras are heavy with foals not yet due and the ground is still too cold to do much more than wait, and I was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the farm and Appos S tax documents when my phone lit up with Claire and Appos S name. She rarely called on weeknights unless something was wrong, and I felt that old half-second of dread I still Haven and Appos T managed to train out of myself since David. End quote. Hey sweetheart. Everything okay? End quote. End quote, yes. End quote. A pause and then in a rush, end quote, actually more than okay mom. End quote. I set my pen down. End quote. I met someone, end quote, she said, the words tumbling over each other the way they hadn't and Appos T since she was a teenager. End quote. Last Saturday at the Bluegrass Equine Welfare Gala. His name is Nathaniel Cole. He and Appos S41 he does financial consulting out of Charlotte and mom, he actually listened. Not the polite version. He asked follow-up questions. He wanted to know what I actually do on a Tuesday. End quote. Something in me lifted, plainly and honestly, at the sound of her. Claire had spent the 3 years since David and Appos S death pouring herself into her practice with a thoroughness that looked from the outside exactly like healing, and that I suspected from the inside was at least partly a very effective way of not having to sit still with grief. And underneath that lift, quieter, came the other thing. The reflex. The one that fires after 31 years on the bench at anything that sounds a half degree too polished. I pressed it down. End quote. Where and oppose, do you two end up talking? End quote. End quote. By the auction tables. He made a joke about the wine being overpriced for a charity event, and I told him that was the entire point of a charity event, and somehow that turned into 2 hours. End quote. End quote. That and oppose, a good sign, end quote, I said. And it was. I meant it. End quote. He texted the next morning, end quote, she said, softer now. End quote. I wanted you to know. End quote. End quote. I and oppose, am glad you told me. End quote. I reached for my pen out of pure old habit. End quote. Tell me about him. Where and oppose is he from? End quote. End quote. Somewhere on the East Coast, he said. He moved to Charlotte about 15 years ago to build his practice, end quote. Somewhere on the East Coast was not a place. I noted it without saying so. End quote. Who does he consult for? End quote. End quote. He and oppose is independent. Works with mid-size companies on acquisitions and restructuring. Says he likes the flexibility. End quote. Independent. No firm. No colleagues to call. I kept my voice easy. End quote. Ever been married? End quote. A small hesitation. End quote. No. He said he was waiting for the right person, end quote. Her voice went careful at the edges, the way it does around something she doesn't, and oppose. T want to bruise by handling too hard. That detail sat in my chest and stayed there. A man of 41, financially comfortable, articulate enough to hold a veterinarian and oppose. Attention for 2 hours at a benefit dinner, and never once married. In 31 years of watching people testify, I had learned that a man like that usually belongs to one of 3 categories. Too consumed by ambition to make room for anyone else, too wounded to try again, or too careful to let anyone get close enough to notice what he was hiding. I told myself I was doing to my daughter and oppose's private life what I used to do to hostile witnesses, and that it wasn't and oppose fair. End quote. He sounds like he made quite an impression, end quote, I said instead. End quote. He wants to meet you, end quote, Claire said. End quote. He said family matters to him. He wants to do it right. End quote. I looked out the dark kitchen window at the shape of the barn against the sky. End quote. Tell him to come to the farm. We and oppose, I'll have dinner. End quote. The relief in her voice was immediate, and it told me she and oppose, been braced for something else, hesitation, conditions, the careful diplomatic caution I and oppose, have been within my rights to offer. End quote. Really? End quote. End quote. Really? Any man who can make you sound like that on a Tuesday in February deserves a fair hearing. End quote. She laughed. A real laugh, unguarded. And we talked for 20 more minutes about nothing important. After we hung up, I sat with my cold tea for a long time, and then I took a legal pad from the drawer, the way I had for 31 years before every trial, and wrote across the top, Nathaniel Cole. 41, Charlotte. Independent consultant. East Coast unspecified. Never married. I underlined never married twice, folded the page, and put it in the drawer with the tax documents. Trust but verify David and oppose. Voice said, quiet and certain, the way it had every evening since. I was still working on the second half. Nathaniel Cole arrived at Ashwood on a Saturday in late March, driving a 2-year-old gray pickup, clean but not showroom clean. The kind of vehicle a careful man chooses specifically because it says nothing at all. He was tall, dark-haired, going a distinguished silver at the temples in a way that looked deliberate rather than accidental, with the loose, unhurried posture of a man who has spent years walking into rooms full of strangers and making them comfortable in under a minute. He carried a bottle of 20-year Woodford Reserve, expensive enough to signal he and oppose, done his homework on where he was standing, restrained enough not to look like he was trying too hard, and he shook my hand and looked me directly in the eye and said, end quote, Judge Calloway, thank you for having me. Claire talks about this place like it and oppose, the center of the world. End quote. Judge, not ma and oppose, am not Margaret, which meant he had looked me up. We walked the property before dinner, the mare barn, the west paddocks, the run down toward the creek where David used to fish on the rare afternoons he allowed himself one. Nathaniel asked good questions in the right order using the right vocabulary, about the breeding fees, about whether we stood our own stallions or sent maras out, about the insurance complexities of a farm carrying that much bloodstock value on 4 legs. End quote. You know horses, end quote, I said. End quote, I and Oppos. V consulted for a few equine operations in the Carolinas, end quote. He said smoothly. End quote. You pick up the vocabulary. End quote. Claire walked beside him with her shoulder occasionally brushing his arm, watching him the way you watch something you and Oppos. Afraid might vanish if you look away. It made my chest ache in a way I didn't, and Oppos. T examined too closely just then. Over dinner on the back porch he was good. Genuinely, professionally good. He talked about acquisitions and restructuring with the kind of measured intelligence that signals competence without inviting real scrutiny. Referenced 2 deals in the Carolinas with enough detail to sound credible and not quite enough to be checked, mentioned clients without naming them, confidentiality, he said, reasonably enough, and complimented David and Oppos' smoker recipe, which Claire had made from memory, with a specificity that suggested he and Oppos' D actually meant it. He never stumbled. Never searched for a word. Every answer connected cleanly to the one before it, the way testimony does when someone has rehearsed not just the facts but the order in which to deliver them. At 7:15 his phone buzzed in his jacket. He glanced at it, expression untroubled. End quote. Excuse me, client on the coast. Forgets the time difference, end quote. He walked to the far porch rail with his back to us. I watched him. His free hand came up and cut through the air twice, short and sharp. The gesture of a man giving instructions, not soothing a nervous client. His shoulders had drawn in tight. The posture of someone absorbing something he didn't and Oppos. T want to hear. Then he turned and caught me watching, and what happened next was the single most honest thing I saw from Nathaniel Cole that entire evening. A reset? Fast and almost invisible. The tension left his shoulders. His face rearranged itself back into the easy, confident version he and Oppos D worn all night, and he walked back to the table and sat down. End quote. Sorry about that, end quote. He said pleasantly. End quote. Deal closing next week. Everyone panics at the finish line. End quote. End quote. I imagine they do, end quote, I said. He reached over and covered Claire and Oppos' hand with his, and she turned her palm up without thinking about it and laced her fingers through his. The automatic gesture of 2 people who had already built a physical shorthand. I looked away and picked up my glass. Later, after his taillights had gone down the drive, Claire found me on the porch with the last of my bourbon and the sound of the horses settling in the paddock below. End quote. Well? End quote, she asked, her voice doing everything it could to sound like the answer didn't end Oppos' matter. End quote. He and Oppos' impressive, end quote, I said and meant it. End quote, but, end quote, she said, because she knows me. End quote, if you and Oppos happy, I and Oppos am happy, end quote, which was also true and which was also not the whole of what I felt. She hugged me quickly and went inside, and I sat alone with the bourbon for a long time, thinking about a man who could reset his own face in half a second, and never once let his guard down for longer than that. Trust but verify, David said in the voice he and Oppos D used with what breath he had left. I folded the paper in my pocket a little tighter and went to bed. By August, Nathaniel had become a fixture at Ashwood the way kudzu becomes a fixture on a Kentucky hillside. Gradually, quietly, and then all at once until you look up one morning and realize it and Oppos' covered everything you wear in and Oppos T watching closely enough. He drove down most weekends. He helped Hollis mend the fence along the east paddock without being asked, learned the names of the barn cats, sat with me after dinner and asked about my years on the bench with the patient, focused attention of a man either genuinely fascinated or expertly practiced at seeming so, until the difference stopped showing. When Claire told me his parents wanted to drive up from Asheville to meet us, I said yes before I and Oppos D fully thought through what I was agreeing to. James and Ruth Cole arrived on a Saturday in a well-kept SUV, in the comfortable unpretentious clothes of people who and Oppos D worked honest jobs. Ruth was 64, warm-eyed, and had a gift for making you feel within 30 seconds that she and Oppos D been looking forward to meeting you specifically. End quote. Judge Calloway, end quote. James said, shaking my hand with a grip that respected the title without being cowed by it. End quote. Nathaniel and Oppos told us so much about this place. I can see why. End quote. End quote. We brought apple butter and quote, Ruth said, pressing a jar into my hands with both of hers. And quote, made it ourselves. More apples than two people know what to do with. And quote, Claire lit up. And quote, oh, my dad used to make something almost exactly like this. And quote, Ruth and Appo's face softened immediately. And quote, Nathaniel told us about David. I and Appo's, I'm so sorry, honey. He sounds like he was a remarkable man. And quote, Claire and Appo's eyes went glassy for a moment, that quick, involuntary shimmer that still catches her off guard when someone mentions her father unexpectedly, and she pressed her lips together and nodded. We ate on the porch and the conversation moved easily. James talked about 32 years with the State Transportation Department, bridges and interchanges across the Carolinas. Ruth described 26 years teaching third grade. The kind of career that leaves a permanent mark on hundreds of people who still remember her name. Nathaniel sat beside Claire, relaxed, occasionally adding a detail to his parents and Appo's stories with the easy familiarity of a man among people he and Appo's known his whole life. And that precisely was what bothered me. Not one story contradicted another. Not one detail needed correcting. None of the low-grade friction that lives in every real family. The gentle interruption, the affectionate disagreement. The story embellished slightly differently each time it gets told. James and Ruth moved through the afternoon with the smooth consistency of people who had reviewed their material and found it satisfactory. And quote, tell me about Nathaniel as a boy, and quote, I said, keeping my tone pleasant. And quote, what was he like? And quote, Ruth smiled, warm and immediate. And quote, oh, he was a handful in the best way. Spent one whole summer trying to rebuild a lawnmower engine he found at a junk sale. Never did get it running. End quote. She shook her head fondly. James chuckled. End quote. Spent more time on that engine than he ever spent on his homework. End quote. Nathaniel grinned. End quote. In my defense, the engine had more interesting problems. End quote. Claire laughed and squeezed his arm, and I noted quietly that the story had the rhythm of something told many times before. The setup, the punchline, the fond headshake, polished smooth by repetition. After lunch, James walked the east paddock with me while the women cleared the table. And quote, you and Appo's, we got something real here, and quote, he said, looking out over the fences. And quote, a lot of families let places like this go. Means something that you Haven and Appo's, End quote. End quote. David and I built it together, end quote, I said. End quote. That makes it harder to let go of. End quote. He nodded slowly. End quote. Nathaniel talks about Claire the way a man talks about something he intends to keep. Wanted you to know that. Father too, end quote. He caught himself gently, end quote. Well, as one parent to another, end quote. His expression was open, sincere, fatherly in exactly the right proportions, and my chest tightened with something I couldn't and Appo's named cleanly, part gratitude, part unease, the specific sensation of being told precisely what you want to hear by someone who seems to already know exactly what that is. End quote, I appreciate that, end quote, I said, and meant it and distrusted meaning it both at once. That evening, after the Coles had driven back toward Asheville, Claire hugged me in the driveway the way she used to when something had gone exactly right. End quote. Thank you, Mom, end quote, she said against my shoulder. End quote. This meant everything. End quote. I held her and said nothing because what was I supposed to say? That her future in-laws had felt to me like a performance I couldn't and Appo's find the seams in? People who had just met me shouldn't and Appo's already know how to make me comfortable. Well past midnight, crossing from the house to check on a mare Hollis had flagged as close to foaling. I passed the equipment barn and saw Nathaniel standing in its shadow, phone to his ear, back to me. His voice was low and clipped, nothing like the easy warmth he used at the dinner table. End quote. I already told you, end quote, he said. End quote. Stop second-guessing the timeline. Everything is moving exactly the way it and Appo's supposed to move. You handle your end. End quote. I stood very still. Not the frustration of a consultant managing an anxious client. The flat, cold authority of a man used to giving orders and having them followed. His boots scraped gravel as he turned, and I stepped back into the shadow of the fence line before he could see me, and waited until I heard him end the call and go back inside. I stood in the dark for a long moment, the warm August air heavy around me, the horses quiet in the paddock. I reached into my pocket. The folded paper with Nathaniel Cole and Appo's name on it was still there, where I and Appo's D put it the night Claire first called. I was beginning to think it was time to unfold it. 3 weeks before the engagement party, on a Sunday morning, my daughter opened her fiancé and Appo's laptop looking for a drug interaction reference, and watched her entire future rearrange itself in about 60 seconds. She didn't and Appo's tell me that night. She didn't and Appo's tell me the next day or the day after that. She carried it alone for 3 weeks, turning it over the way you turn something sharp in your hands, hoping to find an angle where it doesn't and Appo's cut, and she told me everything the morning after the engagement party, not once but twice, because the second time through she remembered details the first pass had shaken loose. Nathaniel had been staying at Ashwood for the weekend. Sunday morning he was in the shower, his laptop open on the guest room desk, the screen still lit. Claire needed to check a medication interaction before her Monday shift and crossed to the desk without thinking about it. The way you use someone in Appo's things when you have decided to trust them completely, and that trust has made you careless. There were 4 browser tabs open. 3 were unremarkable. The 4th was an Excel file. Freshwood liquidity plan.xlsx. She told me later she almost closed it, that her hand was already moving to the tab, and then something in the file name stopped her. Those 2 letters. Nathaniel Cole. No, she looked again. Nancy. Not his initials. Hers backward or almost, and then she understood, not his initials at all. A file he and Appo's D simply mislabeled once out of carelessness, months of naming conventions catching up to him. She opened it. Column A listed asset categories. Real estate, $19 million. Investment accounts, $22 million. The Callaway Family Trust, $6 million. Bloodstock and breeding rights valuation, $3 million. A total at the bottom, $50 million. The figures Warren and Appo's approximate. They were exact, the kind of precision that requires access to actual documents, actual statements, actual filings, the kind of research that takes months and a very specific intention. Column B outline mechanisms. Trust modification. Co-trustee designation. Added authority upon marriage. Joint account structuring. Each one paired with the legal instrument required to execute it. I had established the Callaway Family Trust 22 years earlier and transferred sole trustee authority to Claire when she turned 30, the way David and I had always planned. That meant Claire, only Claire, could authorize changes to the trust and Appo's structure, including adding a co-trustee. A husband, added after the wedding, would carry that same authority. The bank would process transfers signed by both trustees of record without blinking. Column C laid out a timeline. A window of 21 days post-marriage, described in the spreadsheet with a phrase that closed off every innocent explanation Claire tried to construct. Complete before legal recourse can be initiated. You do not write that phrase for a legitimate financial plan. You write it when you are planning to steal something, and you have already timed how long it will take for someone to notice. She heard the shower shut off. She closed the laptop. End quote. My hands were shaking so badly I almost knocked it off the desk, end quote. She told me later, standing in the wet grass of the east paddock with the morning mist still burning off. End quote. I could hear him moving around in the bathroom. I stood at the window trying to breathe like a normal person. End quote. Nathaniel came out with a towel around his waist, relaxed, and smiled at her standing by the window. End quote. Find what you were looking for. End quote. End quote. Yes, end quote, she said. End quote. I think I did. End quote. She kissed him. She made coffee. She sat across from him and talked about engagement party catering and whether the string lights should go up Friday or Saturday. And the whole time, she told me, her heart was slamming so hard against her ribs she could feel it in her fingertips. End quote. I kept trying to find a reason it wasn't Appo's what it looked like, end quote. She said to me, her jaw so tight I could see the muscle working in her cheek, her hands balled at her sides. End quote. Maybe it was a client file with similar letters. Maybe it was something his attorney drew up. I went through every explanation I could think of, Mom. Every single one. End quote. She pressed her lips together hard. End quote. None of them included complete before legal recourse can be initiated. You don and oppose. T write that for a client. You write that when you and oppose. Planning to steal something. And quote. My chest felt hollowed out with something cold. $50 million. Every acre and every foal David and I had spent 34 years building, mapped out in a spreadsheet with a 21-day theft timeline. And quote. Why didn't and oppose, T you call me? And quote. My voice came out rougher than I meant it to. She looked up and her eyes finally broke. Not a flood, one sharp crack, tears spilling fast down both cheeks before she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. End quote. Because I was afraid I was wrong, end quote, she said muffled. End quote. Because if I was wrong I and oppose, D have accused an innocent man and burned down my own life for nothing. And because, end quote, she steadied herself. End quote. Because I needed to be sure before I said it out loud. Saying it out loud makes it real. End quote. I put my hand on her shoulder. End quote. It and oppose, s real, end quote, I said quietly. End quote. And we and oppose, we going to deal with it together. End quote. She nodded, wiped her face with the back of her wrist, and something shifted behind her eyes. From pain into something harder, colder, more useful. It was David and oppose. S look, the one he got when he and oppose. D made a decision and was done reconsidering it. I recognized it instantly, and something in my own chest unclenched just slightly because whatever Nathaniel Cole had built his plan around, he had badly miscalculated one thing. He had chosen the wrong family and oppose, S daughter. April at Ashwood is the whole reason people fall in love with Kentucky. The dogwoods go white along the fence lines, the paddocks turn that impossible new green, and the evening air carries bluegrass and cut hay and something just on the edge of sweet. By the night of Claire and Oppo's engagement party, 60 guests had filled the back lawn, string lights strung between the old sugar maples, catering staff moving trays of bourbon glazed something through a crowd doing steady business at the bar. Claire had spent 3 weeks planning that evening down to the centerpiece flowers, and it showed. The farm had never looked more like a place where good things happen to good people. Nathaniel stood near the center of it all, arm around her waist, laughing at something one of her practice partners had said. Wearing a charcoal jacket with no tie, relaxed and commanding at once, like a man who had already won and was gracious enough not to say so. I stood at the edge of the porch with a glass of bourbon I hadn't and oppose. Tea touched and watched him work the room, the way I had been watching him for 3 weeks. Not for discomfort or hesitation anymore, but for evidence. There is a difference. 31 years on the bench teaches you to understand it precisely. I found him at the bar around 8. And quote, Judge Calloway and quote, he said, raising his glass slightly. And quote, you put together a beautiful evening. And quote. And quote. Claire put it together. I provided the property and stayed out of the way, end quote. He laughed, warm, seemingly genuine. End quote. The sign of a wise woman. Knowing when to contribute and when to let the capable people work. End quote. End quote. Tell me something, end quote. I said, keeping my tone conversational. End quote. The stallion syndication renewal coming up this fall, bluegrass bloodstock and oppose. S been pushing for a 10-year extension. What would you advise from a consultant and oppose? S perspective? End quote. Something crossed his face, fast, almost invisible. The micro-expression of a man asked a question one layer deeper than he and oppose. D prepared for. His eyes made a small recalibration. It lasted less than a second before the easy confidence reasserted itself. End quote. I and oppose. D want to see the current syndication terms before I said anything specific, end quote. He said smoothly, end quote. But generally 10-year commitments in bloodstock favor the buyer unless they're and oppose. S a strong escalation clause. I and oppose. D push for a shorter initial term with renewal options, end quote. Reasonable. Knowledgeable sounding. And general, the kind of answer you give when you and oppose. V read enough to seem credible without knowing enough to be specific. I and oppose. D watched expert witnesses run that exact maneuver for 3 decades. End quote. Good point, end quote, I said pleasantly. End quote. I and oppose. I'll keep that in mind. End quote. He excused himself to find Claire, and I watched him cross the lawn with that unhurried, confident stride. At 8:47, I noted the time. I have a judge and oppose. S habit of it. Claire broke away from a knot of her colleagues near the arbor and crossed the lawn toward me with practiced ease, stopping twice to hug guests, laughing at something someone said, entirely composed. 3 weeks of carrying what she knew had given her a performer and oppos. Discipline I hadn't and oppos. T expected and couldn't and oppos. T help but admire. She reached me at the stone wall at the edge of the garden, wrapped both hands around my arm the way she used to when she wanted to tell me something urgent, leaned her cheek nearly to mine. End quote, Mom. End quote. Barely a breath, stripped down to pure necessity. End quote. Get people toward the house. Call 911. End quote. She stepped back, turned to a passing guest with a full and genuine-looking smile, hugged them briefly, and walked back across the lawn to Nathaniel. She slipped her hand into his. She laughed at something he said. I stood at the stone wall with my untouched bourbon and felt the words land in my chest like something dropped from a height. Not I need to talk to you. Not something in oppos s wrong. The police. She had seen something tonight, something specific enough, something serious enough, that her first instinct was law enforcement, not conversation. I breathed in slowly through my nose. I straightened my jacket. I lifted my glass and took a small measured sip, because a woman standing at the edge of her daughter and oppos' engagement party needs to look like a woman enjoying her daughter and oppos' engagement party. Across the lawn, Nathaniel caught my eye, raised his own glass in a small easy toast, and smiled warm, confident, the smile of a man who had thought of everything. I raised mine in return. For the next 40 minutes I was the mother of the bride. I shook hands and asked after grandchildren and laughed at the right moments, and the whole time underneath every word, my mind ran the way it used to run during the hardest trials, cold, fast, entirely focused, sorting through what I knew and what I needed to know and exactly what I was going to do the moment the last car left my driveway. After the guests were gone and Nathaniel had walked Claire to the guest house, I went inside, locked the front door, and climbed the stairs to David and Oppo's old study, where his photograph still sat on the corner of the desk, the one from the spring before his diagnosis, laughing at something off camera, late light in his hair. End quote, you knew, end quote, I said to the photograph. End quote, you saw something in him before he ever set foot on this place, didn't and Oppos, tu. That and Oppos, what the second promise was for. End quote. The photograph didn't and Oppos t answer. But I heard him anyway. Trust but verify, Margaret. Especially with Claire. Tomorrow morning I was going to start verifying everything. I was awake at 4 a.m. and by 5:30 I had already texted Claire. East Paddock alone now. And by 5:40 she was walking across the wet grass in a barn jacket thrown over her pajamas, barefoot, hair uncombed. She hadn't an Oppos t slept either. We walked the length of the east fence line before either of us spoke, far enough from the guest house that Nathaniel would see only two figures out early, a mother and daughter sharing a quiet morning. End quote. Tell me everything, end quote, I said. End quote, from the beginning. End quote. She told me about the laptop, the spreadsheet, the 21-day window, the 3 weeks of searching for an explanation that didn't and Oppos t make her sick. Then she told me what she and Oppos d seen the night before at the party. End quote. He put his phone face up on the cocktail table, end quote, she said, her voice flat and controlled. End quote, says it and Oppos so people know he and Oppos not distracted. Last night he set it down while he was talking to one of my partners and I was 2 feet away, and it lit up with a notification. A photo confirmation from his camera roll, end quote. She pressed her lips together. End quote, it was a document. Letterhead I recognized, the same cream stock you use for the trust files. From your study, end quote. My chest went cold. End quote. He and Oppos been photographing documents out of my study, end quote. End quote, that and Oppos what it looked like. He and Oppos been in the house alone twice this month, while I was on calls and you were at the barn. I didn't and Oppos t think anything of it. I trusted him, Mom. End quote, the last 3 words came out raw. End quote, you trusted him because he was built to be trusted, end quote, I said. End quote, that and Oppos not a failure of your judgment. That and Oppos what he does for a living. End quote. End quote, what do we do? Call it in right now? Confront him? End quote. End quote, no, end quote, I said immediately. End quote, not yet. If he and Oppos, S what I think he is, he and Oppos, S done this before. He and Oppos, S a professional. The moment he suspects we know, he and Oppos, S in that truck and down the driveway before we finish a sentence. And we will never see him again and never be able to prove a thing he planned. Right now the only advantage we have is that he believes we and Oppos, Re still in the dark. The second that changes we lose everything. End quote. She stared at the fence line, jaw working. End quote. So I keep pretending. End quote. End quote. Yes. I know how hard that is. I am calling our estate attorney this morning. Then an investigator, someone who does this professionally. We find out who he actually is and what he and Oppos S done before, and we build something that holds up. Then we move. End quote. She was quiet for a long moment. When she turned back to me, the raw pain was still there underneath, but overlaid now with something colder and entirely purposeful. End quote. He was going to marry me on a Saturday, end quote, she said, end quote. Sign the paperwork Friday, rob us by Monday, and smile at me through the whole thing. End quote. End quote. That appears to be the plan. End quote. Her chin came up. End quote. Then let and Oppos S make sure it and Oppos S the last plan he ever runs. End quote. Across the yard, a light came on in the guest house kitchen. Nathaniel, coffee mug in hand, glanced out toward the paddock and raised the mug in a cheerful wave. Claire raised her hand and waved back, her face warm and easy, giving away nothing at all. 20 minutes later he was at my kitchen table eating eggs and discussing whether the wedding tent would need sidewalls in October, entirely certain everything was proceeding exactly as planned, with no idea that the two women across the table from him had just decided to dismantle him. The first call went to Vivian Hale, who had been the Calloway family and Oppos S estate attorney for 16 years, a sharp, precise woman of 58 who wore navy suits to depositions and had never once been underestimated twice. End quote. Margaret. What in Oppos S wrong? End quote. End quote. I need to understand something about the family trust, end quote, I said. End quote. Hypothetically, end quote. A pause. Vivian knew me well enough to know I don't and Oppos T ask hypothetical questions. End quote. Go ahead. End quote. End quote. Claire gets married. Her husband and Oppos S added as co-trustee. How fast can assets move? End quote. The pause this time was longer, and when she spoke again her voice had dropped half a register. The shift from attorney to ally. End quote. The Calloway Family Trust was set up under Kentucky Code. Claire and Oppos S been sole trustee since she turned 30. You don't and Oppos T carry signing authority anymore, Margaret, which means you can and Oppos T unilaterally block a modification she initiates. End quote. A beat. End quote. Are you telling me what I think you and Oppos retelling me? End quote. End quote. Just answer the question. End quote. End quote. With proper documentation, modification form, co-trustee designation, marriage certificate establishing standing. A co-trustee can authorize wire transfers within 48 to 72 hours of being added to an account. Kentucky banks process trustee transactions same day if the paperwork and Oppos S in order. There and Oppos S no legal obligation to delay or investigate a transaction executed by two trustees of record. End quote. Her voice went very flat. End quote. By the time you could initiate legal intervention, the money and Oppos S already in a jurisdiction we can and Oppos T touch. End quote. End quote. $50 million. End quote. I said. End quote. In 21 days. End quote. I heard her exhale sharply. End quote. Margaret. Tell me everything. End quote. I did, the spreadsheet, the exact figures, the phrase about legal recourse, the photograph documents, 11 months of a performance so polished it had fooled everyone in this family except a man 3 years dead, who had somehow still seen it coming. When I finished, Vivian was quiet for 4 full seconds. End quote. I have a contact at the FBI. Financial Crimes, Louisville Field Office. Agent Farah Doyle. She and Oppos S thorough, she and Oppos S aggressive, and she and Oppos S going to want this case. End quote. A pause. End quote. But she needs evidence, Margaret. Real evidence. Not a spreadsheet Claire saw for 60 seconds. End quote. End quote. I and Oppos am hiring an investigator. When I have proof I and oppose, I'll call you. End quote. End quote. Move fast, end quote, Vivian said. End quote. If this man is working a timeline, you and oppose. Already behind it. End quote. The second call went to Renee Okafor, a forensic accountant I and oppose. D met years earlier during a federal investigation into a tax fraud scheme touching 4 states and a dozen shell companies. She and oppose. D left the IRS and oppose. S criminal division 8 years back and built a private practice that was discreet, expensive, and worth every dollar. End quote. I need a full background investigation, end quote. I told her. End quote. Name, Nathaniel Cole, 41. Claims to be a financial consultant based in Charlotte. Says he and oppose. S from somewhere on the East Coast, no specific state. Independent practice, no firm affiliation, never married. No visible social footprint beyond a thin LinkedIn. End quote. End quote. What and oppose S the timeline. End quote. End quote. My daughter marries him in 10 weeks. She found a spreadsheet 6 days ago outlining a plan to move $50 million out of the family trust within 3 weeks of the wedding. End quote. Renee didn't and oppose. T respond immediately. I heard the scratch of a pen. End quote. Clean surface presence or genuinely clean. End quote. End quote. Too clean. His digital footprint looks built rather than lived. No employment gaps, no old photos, no trail of complaints. Everything exactly right. End quote. End quote. That and oppose. Essa constructed identity, end quote, she said. It wasn't an oppose, T a question. End quote. How thorough do you need? End quote. End quote. I need to know who he actually is, what he and oppose S done before, and who and oppose S helping him. I need evidence that survives a federal courtroom, end quote. End quote. 10 days for thorough. I can push the critical leads, identity verification, prior operations, known associates to 3. The financial trail takes longer. End quote. End quote. 3 days on the critical leads. Call me the moment you find anything. End quote. End quote. Understood. End quote. A pause. End quote. Judge Calloway. If this man is what you and oppose. Redescribing he and oppose. S done this before. Nobody builds this kind of operational sophistication on a first attempt. End quote. End quote. That and oppose. S exactly what I and oppose am afraid of, end quote, I said. I want to stop the forward motion of this story for a moment, because what Renee found in the days that followed came to me the way most bad news does now. Over the phone, secondhand, a name and a number and a fact delivered efficiently by someone who has learned not to let her voice carry more than the facts require. And I don and oppose. T think you can understand what we were actually up against unless you sit, for a minute, somewhere Renee and oppose S report never took you. Somewhere outside Asheville, North Carolina, for years before any of this, there was a man named Thomas Whitaker who ran a small furniture restoration business out of a converted tobacco barn, the kind of place that survived on word of mouth and 40 years of careful, honest work. His wife had died young and he and oppose D raised his daughter Bethany largely alone, driving her to law school 200 miles away every August, calling her every Sunday at 6:00 and oppose clock whether either of them had anything new to say or not, because the calling itself was the point. Bethany was the one who introduced her father to a man she knew at the time as Marcus Dunmore, charming, well-spoken, a financial consultant she and oppose D met through a friend from her firm who took an interest in Thomas and oppose S plans to expand the restoration business into a second location. Marcus visited the barn. He asked good questions. He offered, eventually, to help structure an investment that would let Thomas take on the lease for a second building without touching his retirement accounts. It took him 5 months to gain the access he needed and about 6 weeks to disappear with almost everything Thomas Whitaker had. The business folded within 4 months. Thomas spent half a year trying to find Marcus Dunmore through every channel he had. The police, a private investigator he couldn't and oppose T really afford, the state attorney. I tell you this now out of order because I think you should carry it with you through the rest of what follows the way I had to carry it once I knew it. Not as a statistic Renee read off a list, but as a father who showed up every Sunday at 6:00 and oppose clock and a daughter who has spent 3 years finding out what happened to him. Renee called on the 6th day, at 11 in the morning. I was in the East Paddock, checking a fence line that didn't and oppose. T need checking, needing somewhere to put my hands while I waited for the world to finish rearranging itself. End quote. His name is not Nathaniel Cole, end quote, she said. End quote. It and oppose S. Caleb Ferris. Born in Bowling Green, Kentucky in 1983. I have his birth certificate, his original social security number, his juvenile record from Warren County. There is no Nathaniel Cole. There never was. End quote. My knees went unsteady. I put a hand on the top wire and held on. A Kentucky man. He and oppose. D known this land from the inside. The culture, the cadence, the correct way to compliment a smoker recipe and ask about a stallion syndication and shake a retired judge and oppose. S hand. He hadn't and oppose. T been performing Southern credibility. He and oppose. D been using his own. End quote. Keep going, end quote, I said. End quote. For years ago, under the name Marcus Dunmore, he ran an operation outside Asheville. You and oppose. LL want to sit down for the rest of that one. I and oppose. LL send you the file. 2 years ago, in Knoxville, he tried something similar under a third identity, but a colleague of a colleague started pulling on his references and he cut and ran before it went further. And 18 months ago, in Chattanooga, under a fourth name, he ran a much larger operation against a woman named Priya Sethna, daughter of a commercial developer worth somewhere north of 80 million, end quote. End quote. What happened there? End quote. End quote. Her father hired his own investigator after noticing irregularities in her accounts, confronted Caleb privately, paid him $3.5 million to sign an NDA, break the engagement and disappear, to protect his daughter from the publicity of a fraud prosecution, end quote. The fury that moved through me was cold, not hot. End quote. He paid him, end quote. End quote. Wired to an offshore account within 72 hours of the NDA. My contact says the father told her he regrets it every single day. It didn't and oppose. T stop Caleb. It funded him. End quote. Renee and oppose. S voice hardened slightly. End quote. And it sent him to his next target. Your daughter. End quote. $3.5 million, taken from a man trying to protect his daughter, used to finance the operation against mine. End quote. Is he working alone? End quote. End quote. No, end quote. Something new entered her voice. End quote. I traced the legal documentation from the Chattanooga job to a former paralegal in Roanoke named Dana Whitfield. 44. Specialized in trust and estate law at a firm she left 3 years ago under circumstances they won and oppose. T discuss. No reference letter, no announcement. She and oppose. S listed now as an independent legal consultant with no verifiable clients. Her income runs through a shell company. Caleb and oppose. S listed as a silent co-owner under a variant of his birth name. End quote. End quote. And the parents? James and Ruth Cole, they knew things about David about this family. Specific things, end quote. A pause. End quote. I ran them separately. They and oppose. Real people. A retired couple from Asheville. No criminal history at all. Caleb found them through a talent agency that books background actors for corporate events and stage scenarios. He paid them $4,000 each to play his parents for an afternoon. Told them he was surprising his girlfriend and oppose. S family as part of an elaborate proposal setup. End quote. Another pause. End quote. They Don and oppose. T appear to know the real nature of what they participated in. End quote. The cold that moved through me then had nothing to do with the temperature. End quote. Send everything to Vivian tonight. End quote, I said. End quote. And Renee, find out who else knew. He had information about this family he could not have gathered from Charlotte. Someone gave him Claire and Oppo's schedule. Someone told him about the trust. End quote. End quote. I and Oppo's. LL keep digging. End quote. I stood in the paddock a long while after the call ended, the sun climbing over the timber line, the maras moving slow through the wet grass, and thought about a man named Thomas Whitaker who had shown up every Sunday at 6:00 and Oppo's clock for a daughter who no longer had anyone to call. I made myself a promise standing there. This ends with us. I want to give you the part of this that Claire never described to me all at once. She gave it to me in pieces over months, some of it only after the whole thing was finished and she finally felt safe enough to say it out loud. There were 8 weeks between the morning we decided not to confront Caleb and the night we finally did. And for every one of those 56 days, my daughter had breakfast across the table from a man she knew intended to destroy her, and laughed at his jokes, and let him take her hand and gave absolutely nothing away. She told me once much later about a particular Thursday in the 6th week. She and Oppos, D had a hard day at the practice, a colic case that didn't end Oppos. T end well, the kind of loss that follows a large animal vet home no matter how many years she and Oppos S done the work, and she came back to her apartment in Lexington to find 3 missed calls from Caleb and a text asking whether she and Oppos D decided on a caterer for the rehearsal dinner. End quote. I sat on my kitchen floor and quote, she told me end quote, with my back against the cabinet, and I thought very clearly, I cannot do this for 2 more months. I thought about just telling him, just looking at him and saying I know what you are, and letting whatever happen next happen because at least it would be real and I was so tired of performing my own life. End quote. She didn't end Oppos T call me that night. She sat on the floor until it passed, and then she called Caleb back and told him yes, she and Oppos D decided on the caterer, and her voice, she said, didn't end Oppos T shake at all, and she hated herself a little for how easy the lying had become. There was another night, she told me this one first, in the immediate aftermath, still raw, when Caleb reached for her hand across the dinner table at Ashwood and she felt her whole body want to pull away, an animal reflex faster than thought, and she and Oppos D had to consciously, deliberately, will her fingers to close around his instead. End quote. It and Oppos S the worst thing I and Oppos V ever done, end quote, she said. End quote. Not catching him, touching him like I loved him, after I knew, end quote. I found her twice in my own kitchen in those weeks, after Caleb had gone to the guest house for the night. Once standing at the sink with the water running, her forehead against the cabinet, her shoulders shaking without sound. Once at 2 a.m. with a cup of tea gone cold in front of her, staring at nothing. Both times I sat down beside her and neither of us said anything that needed to be said out loud, because there wasn't an Oppos T anything to say that would make the 8 weeks shorter. She never broke. Not once, not in front of him. I think about that a great deal still, that my daughter, alone absorbing all of it, held a performance steadier than any I ever watched from a professional witness in 31 years on the bench, and she did it without a law degree or a badge or any of the training that and Oppos S supposed to make that kind of composure possible. She did it because she loved the people it would protect more than she hated the man it required her to lie to. There is one more thing I need to tell you about before the sting because I did not understand its significance until much later, and I think you deserve to have it in its right place rather than the place I actually learned it. In early May, 3 weeks after Renee and Oppos S call, 5 weeks before the rehearsal dinner, I drove into Lexington for a Kentucky Horse Council fundraiser I and Oppos D been attending for 11 years without incident. Near the silent auction tables, a man I didn't and Oppos T recognize approached me, 70 or so, silver-haired, well-dressed in the particular way of men who used to have somewhere important to be every morning in Haven, and Oppos T fully adjusted to not having it anymore. End quote. Judge Calloway, end quote, he said. End quote. I Don and Oppos T expect you and Oppos D remember me. Franklin Reyes. End quote. I did remember him, though it took a moment to place the face against the name. He had sat on the federal bench in this district before I did, a decade my senior, and I recalled, distantly, some unpleasantness at the end of his tenure that I and Oppos D never learned the details of and had never particularly wanted to. End quote. Judge Reyes, end quote, I said. End quote. It and Oppos S been a long time. End quote. End quote. It has, end quote. He smiled, pleasant, unremarkable. End quote. I read about your daughter and Oppos S engagement in the Bar Association bulletin. Lovely photograph. You must be very happy, end quote. End quote. We are, end quote, I said and thought nothing more of it. A courteous exchange with a retired colleague at a horse charity, the kind of small collision that happens constantly in a state where everyone who and Oppos S ever practiced law seems to know everyone else who has. I did not think of Franklin Reyes again until the night Caleb Ferris said his name to me in a barn 3 months later. And by then it was already far too late to have wondered at that fundraiser exactly how a man I hadn't and Oppos T spoken to in 8 years already knew the details of my daughter and Oppos S private life. I tell you this now because I think it matters that the warning was there, small and polite and entirely deniable, weeks before I understood there was anything to be warned about. It is the nature of the kind of patience some people carry that you rarely see it until it has already finished its work. Vivian called with the FBI 6 days after Renee and Apos' report. Agent Farah Doyle came out to Ashwood herself, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, close-cropped dark hair, the particular stillness of someone who and Apos' learned the best interrogation technique is simply to wait. We sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours while she walked me through the plan with the precision of a surgeon narrating a procedure she and Apos' performed many times. And quote, we let them believe everything and Apos' proceeding on schedule and quote, she said, spreading a floor plan of the Bourbon Manor Hotel, where the rehearsal dinner would be held, across the table. And quote, Dana Whitfield will check in the day before under her consulting firm and Apos' name, present herself to Caleb as a legal advisor helping with post-marriage estate planning. That and Apos' her cover for delivering the documents. She and Apos' done exactly this in at least 2 prior operations and quote, she tapped the floor plan. And quote, you and Apos' wear a recorder here, breast pocket, left side 6-hour battery. Everything you hear, we hear in real time from a vehicle in the parking structure. The moment you have verbal confirmation, both of them discussing the documents and the transfer plan, you send me one word, and my team is inside within 60 seconds. End quote. End quote. And if they separate, end quote. End quote, you follow Caleb. He and Apos' the primary. Whitfield won and Apos' run without him, end quote, she folded the floor plan. End quote. I need to ask you something directly, Judge Calloway. Can your daughter sit across from this man for 8 more weeks without showing him what she knows? End quote. I thought about 31 years of watching people testify without ever once letting my own face give anything away. End quote. Yes, end quote, I said. End quote, she can. End quote. End quote, good. Because the moment he suspects, he runs, and if he runs, he rebuilds, and he finds someone else and Apos' daughter, end quote. The rehearsal dinner was held on a Friday evening in June. 42 guests gathered in a private room at the Bourbon Manor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a garden gone gold in the last of the light. It smelled of peonies and roasted chicken, and the particular anticipation of people who believed they were celebrating something real. Dana Whitfield had checked into room 412 that afternoon under her firm and Apos' name. Agent Doyle confirmed it by text at 4:00 and Apos' clock, one word, confirmed. Caleb arrived at 7 in a dark suit, hair neat, and went straight to Claire, took both her hands, kissed her cheek, looked at her the way a man looks at something he and Apos' worked very hard to acquire. Claire smiled back with her whole face, warm and open and entirely convincing. 8 weeks of practice had made her extraordinary. I found him at the bar 20 minutes in. End quote. You clean up well for someone who spends his weekends in a barn, end quote. He said, raising his glass. End quote. I had a good reason tonight. End quote. I looked at him directly. End quote. How are you feeling? Big weekend. End quote. End quote. Couldn't and Apos' be better. End quote. He took a sip. End quote. 2 more days and she and Apos' mine. End quote. Mine landed with a precision I Don and Apos' think he intended. At 8:30 he stood to give a toast, glass raised, eyes settling on Claire at the center of the table. End quote. I spent a long time believing some people just Don and Apos' get what they deserve, end quote. He said, smooth and warm and entirely false in every syllable. End quote. Then I met Claire and I understood that if you and Apos' patient enough, careful enough, you get exactly what you and Apos' been working toward, end quote. He raised his glass higher. End quote, to Claire. To family. To everything that and Apos' about to begin. End quote. The room applauded. I raised my own glass and thought, you have no idea how right you are about getting exactly what you and Apos' been working toward. At 8:52 he excused himself. A client call, he said, kissing Claire and Apos' forehead with practiced tenderness, and walked toward the elevators. I waited 4 minutes, long enough that no one would connect my departure to his, excused myself quietly, and took the stairs to the 3rd floor. I heard them before I reached the door. End quote. Modification forms are here and quote, Dana Whitfield and Oppos, S voice clipped and stripped of warmth, end quote. Trust Amendment, page 4. Co-trustee authorization under your name as her spouse. Page 7, grantor approval, Claire and Oppos, S signature line. Both signatures obtained Saturday evening. I submit to the bank Monday morning, end quote. End quote. Timeline after submission, end quote. Caleb said, calm, satisfied. End quote. Monday submission. Tuesday morning confirmation. Tuesday afternoon. Funds moved to the intermediary account in Delaware. By Tuesday evening they and Oppos. In the account in Lisbon. We fly out Tuesday at 2. End quote. A pause. End quote. By Wednesday morning, $50 million is distributed across shell accounts in 4 jurisdictions. Even with FBI involvement, international recovery takes 3 to 5 years minimum. By the time Margaret Calloway understands what happened, we and Oppos. Gone and the money and Oppos. S untraceable, end quote. End quote. And the mother? End quote. Caleb asked. Whitfield made a sound almost like a laugh. End quote. She hasn't and Oppos. T had signing authority on that trust since Claire turned 30. No legal standing to block or reverse a co-trustee transaction with proper documentation. There and Oppos. S nothing she can do. End quote. I had everything I needed. I took my phone out and typed one word. Now. Then I did something Agent Doyle had not planned for. Maybe it was 31 years of needing to see the moment a verdict landed. Maybe it was simply the part of me that was not a judge but a mother. I knocked on the door. Caleb opened it. His expression moved through surprise, calculation, and something colder, in the space of 2 seconds. Behind him, Dana Whitfield stood rigid at the desk, papers spread across the surface. Claire stepped into the doorway beside me. Then her closest friend Priya Anand 1 step behind her. A last-minute addition Doyle hadn't and Oppos. T argued about once I and Oppos, D asked. Caleb looked at Claire. Something crossed his face. Not guilt, but the specific recalibrating expression of a man discovering the asset he planned to take has been watching him the entire time. End quote. Not Claire, end quote. He started. End quote. Don and Oppos T, end quote, she said, and her voice was steady enough to cut glass. End quote. Don and Oppos T say my name like that. Not anymore. End quote. 60 seconds later Agent Doyle came through the door with 2 agents behind her. Badges raised. It was almost over. End quote. Caleb Ferris, end quote. Doyle said, badge out, voice carrying the particular finality of federal law enforcement in the moment it stops being procedural. End quote. Also known as Nathaniel Cole, Marcus Dunmore, and at least 2 other identities. You and Oppos. Under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, identity theft, interstate fraud, and attempted grand larceny. End quote. She turned to Whitfield. End quote. Dana Whitfield, arrested as primary accomplice, conspiracy, forgery, wire fraud. End quote. Whitfield said nothing. Her face had gone the color of old concrete, jaw set, eyes fixed somewhere past the wall. Caleb didn't and Oppos. T resist the cuffs. He stood with his wrists behind his back and looked at Claire with an expression that had shed every layer of the performance, leaving something stripped and cold underneath. Then he looked at me. End quote. You want to know who I am? End quote. His voice was quiet, quieter than anger, which was worse. End quote. Born in Bowling Green, Kentucky. 41 years old, end quote. He held my gaze steadily. End quote. And 15 years ago, you sentenced my brother to 11 years in federal prison. End quote. The room seemed to contract. I searched my memory the way I and Oppos. D searched it 1,000 times over a career methodically without rushing wire fraud cases, securities conspiracies, Kentucky defendants. Then it came Ryan Ferris. 2009. Wire fraud and securities conspiracy out of the Western District. Ryan had been 28. A financial services associate who defrauded a dozen retired clients through a series of fictitious investment funds. The evidence had been overwhelming. I and Oppos. D denied his appeal twice. He and Oppos. D been sentenced to 11 years. End quote. End quote. I denied it because the evidence was conclusive. End quote. I said. End quote. He defrauded 12 retired people. Some of them lost everything. End quote. End quote. He died in that prison. End quote. Caleb and Appo's voice cracked once and sealed itself again. End quote. Year 4. Cardiac event. He was 32. The facility and Appo's medical response was inadequate. I got a phone call from a corrections officer I and Appo's never met, telling me my brother was gone. End quote. He exhaled sharply. End quote. I had no money for a proper burial. I had nothing left. End quote. Claire stood in the doorway with her arms crossed tight, her face unreadable. Priya had a hand on her arm. Whitfield stepped forward from where an agent had positioned her, voice flat. End quote. Renee Okafor found the connection, I assume. End quote. She didn't. And Appo's wait for an answer. End quote. Our father was a man named Douglas Pratt. He left Caleb and Appo's mother when Caleb was 6. He left mine when I was 8. 2 families he walked away from without looking back, and built himself a whole legitimate life on the other side of it. End quote. Her eyes moved to me with a contempt aged over years. End quote. Caleb found me through a DNA registry 7 years ago. We recognized each other immediately, not just by blood, by what had been done to us. End quote. She looked back at Doyle. End quote. Wealthy families with their perfect estates, their trusts, reminded us of everything we never got. So we took from them. End quote. Doyle stepped between us. End quote. That and Appo's enough. Take them out. End quote. Caleb turned, then stopped just for a breath and looked back at me over his shoulder. End quote. Ask yourself something. End quote. He said, low enough that only I could hear. End quote. I and Appo's am good at what I do, Judge Calloway. But I and Appo's am not good enough to find your daughter and Appo's schedule, your trust structure, your family and Appo's private records on my own from Charlotte. End quote. His eyes were steady and cold and completely certain. End quote. Someone gave me everything I needed. Someone close to this family wanted this to happen. You caught me. End quote. A pause. End quote. You Haven and Appo's found them yet. End quote. Then the agents walked him out, his footsteps fading down the carpeted corridor until the sound disappeared entirely. Claire crossed the room in 3 steps and pressed her face into my shoulder. For the first time in 8 weeks, she didn't and Appo's have to perform anything. The shaking started immediately. Not loud, just the deep involuntary tremor of a body releasing 2 months of sustained tension all at once. End quote. It and Appo's done. End quote. I said against her hair. End quote. Is it? End quote. She said, muffled. End quote. He said someone gave him everything. Someone who knew us. End quote. I looked at Agent Doyle, who was already on her phone, expression tight. She met my eyes and gave a single nod. I heard it. I and Appo's am already looking. We were back at Ashwood by 9:30. Claire sat at the kitchen table with both hands around a mug of chamomile tea gone cold 20 minutes earlier, staring at the middle distance with the specific exhaustion of a body that and Appo's finally stopped running on adrenaline and doesn't and Appo's know yet what to replace it with. Priya sat beside her, close enough to touch, saying only what needed saying. I stood at the window looking out at the dark paddock and thought about Caleb Ferris being processed at a federal holding facility in Lexington, and thought it was finished, and missed David with a sharpness that surprised me even 3 years on. My phone rang at 11:15. Agent Doyle. End quote. Judge Calloway. Caleb Ferris escaped custody during transport. He attacked the transport officer at a stoplight 4 miles from the hotel. The officer and Appo's injured but stable. Ferris fled on foot into the tree line along the parkway. End quote. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to mean something. End quote. We have a regional search underway, FBI, State Police, County Sheriff. But I need you to secure your property immediately. He knows where you live. He knows the layout. And he has nothing left to lose tonight. End quote. The kitchen felt like it shrank by half. Claire was already looking at me, having heard enough from across the room to understand. End quote. He and Appo's coming here. End quote, she said. Not a question. End quote. We Don and Appo's know that. End quote. I said, which was true and not reassuring. End quote. He and Appo's coming here. End quote. She said again, steady in the way that comes not from calm but from having already sat with the worst possibility and decided to stand in it anyway. I locked every ground floor door and window while Priya stayed with Claire in the kitchen. 2 Sheriff and Oppo's deputies arrived 18 minutes after Doyle and Oppo's call, one at the front gate, one at the back porch. I told Claire to go up to her old room and lock the door and not open it for anyone but me. She looked at me a long moment before she went. And quote, "Be careful. Please," end quote. End quote, "I and Oppo's, we been careful for 66 years," end quote, I said. End quote. "Tonight I ascend and Oppo's, the night that changes," end quote. She went up. I heard the lock turn. I sat in David and Oppo's study with the lights off, watching the paddock in the dark, the timber line a solid black mass against a sky with too many clouds for stars. 1:45 I heard it, not outside. Below me. From the direction of the equipment barn, where Hollis kept the tractors and where I maintained a small fireproof safe bolted to the concrete floor, holding estate documents, account records, the trust files. Caleb had helped Hollis rehang that barn door in May. He knew exactly what was inside. I moved through the house without turning on lights, took the back stairs, crossed the dark kitchen, went out the side door into the night. The deputy on the back porch was on the far side of the terrace, his flashlight moving along the fence line. I crossed the yard in 30 seconds, pushed the barn door open and stepped inside. I hit the wall switch. Caleb stood at the far end near the safe, back to me, hands working the combination. His jacket was gone, his shirt torn at the shoulder, a cut above his ear crusted dark. His hands were shaking, not from cold, but from the accumulated cost of a night that had destroyed 15 years of planning in 2 hours. He spun when the lights came on, eyes wild in a way I and Oppo's never seen from him. End quote, "Stay back." End quote. End quote. "The deputies are 30 yards away," end quote. I said, keeping my voice level. End quote, "You and Oppo's, not leaving this barn, Caleb." End quote. End quote, "I just need the account numbers." End quote, his voice cracked. End quote, "The files in that safe, I can still get out," end quote. End quote, "It and Oppo's over." It was over the moment Claire opened that laptop in March, end quote. Something shifted in his face. The wild desperation collapsed inward, and what replaced it was a grief so old and so heavy it looked like it had been waiting behind his eyes for years for exactly this moment to surface. End quote, "You took everything from my family," end quote. He said, voice dropping to something almost quiet. End quote, "Ryan was all I had. He raised me. He made one bad decision and you buried him for 11 years," end quote. His chin trembled. End quote, "He died in that prison because the medical staff didn't and Oppo's move fast enough, and I got a phone call from a stranger telling me he was gone, and you never even knew his name until tonight." End quote. My chest ached with something complicated. Not sympathy for what he and Oppo's done, but undeniable grief for what had been done to him a long time ago, by failures that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with the ordinary cruelty of systems that process people without remembering they and Oppo's people. End quote. "I knew Ryan Ferris and Oppo's name," end quote, I said quietly. End quote, "I knew his case. I and Oppo's am sorry for what happened to him after my courtroom. I am not sorry for the sentence." End quote. He lunged. Fast, desperate, both hands reaching for the safe. I stepped directly into his path, not to stop him physically, but to plant myself between him and the door, the way you stand when you and Oppo's decided this ends here and nowhere else. He hit my shoulder hard. We both went down, and I grabbed the frame of the equipment shelf and pinned his arm against the concrete long enough to matter. It was not graceful. It was 66 years old and the specific stubbornness of a woman who had been waiting 8 weeks for exactly this moment. I got my mouth open. End quote, "Now. East Barn." End quote. Boots on gravel at a dead run. The door burst open and 2 deputies crossed the floor in 4 strides and had him by both arms before either of us had fully gotten back to our feet. As they dragged him toward the door, he turned back, face bleeding from where it had met the wall, eyes burning. End quote, "Franklin Reyes," end quote. He said, low and fierce. End quote. "Former federal judge, Eastern, the man who and Oppo's known about my daughter and Oppo's engagement before I and Oppo's ever thought to wonder how." I sat at David and Oppo's desk with my hands still unsteady, blood drying on my collar, his photograph watching from the corner. I typed the name into my laptop and waited 4 seconds. Franklin Reyes, former Chief Judge, United States District Court, Eastern District of Kentucky, appointed 1991, served 19 years. Resigned in 2010 following a judicial conduct investigation into allegations of improper financial relationships with attorneys appearing before his court, specifically, paid consulting arrangements funneled through a shell company, from 2 firms whose cases he had ruled on favorably over a 6-year period. The investigation had been triggered by a confidential complaint to the Sixth Circuit and Oppo's Judicial Council. The complainant and Oppo's name had never been made public. I knew who it was because I had filed it in the winter of 2010. After a case review committee I served on that year turned up a pattern I couldn't and Oppo's TNC, the same attorneys, the same favorable rulings, financial structures opaque enough to survive casual scrutiny but not the scrutiny of a woman trained to find exactly what people were trying to hide. I had reported it because it was the right thing to do. I had not enjoyed it. I had not hesitated. Franklin Reyes had lost everything because I told the truth about what he and Oppo's done, and he had spent 15 years since deciding how to make me pay for it. I called Renee Okafor at midnight. She answered on the first ring, which told me she and Oppo's been waiting. End quote, Reyes, end quote, I said. End quote, I and Oppo's been running his financials for the last 2 hours, end quote. Her voice carried the tight focus of someone deep in a trail of numbers. End quote. Consulting LLC registered in Delaware in 2018. Sole listed officer is his wife Eleanor Reyes. 3 wire transfers from her personal account to a shell company called Ferris Advisory Services. $67,000 each, spread 18 months apart, totaling just over $200,000. The first transfer was dated 4 months after Caleb Ferris created the Nathaniel Cole identity. End quote. She paused. End quote. The payments line up exactly with the 3 phases of his operation: reconnaissance, relationship building, execution. End quote. My jaw tightened until my back teeth ached. End quote. He funded every stage. End quote. End quote. And provided the intelligence Caleb Kuden and Oppo's have gathered on his own. Claire and Oppo's schedule, the trust structure, your financial account numbers, the engagement party date 6 months in advance. Reyes sat on the bench when you established the Callaway Family Trust. He still moved in the same legal circles as your estate attorneys and Oppo's predecessor firm for years afterward. Vivian confirmed it this afternoon. Reyes and a senior partner from her old firm attended the same judicial conference 3 years running. Trust structures, beneficiary details, asset summaries, the kind of information that flows in professional conversations between colleagues who consider themselves above needing to guard it. End quote. A pause. End quote. He didn't and Oppo's steal the documents, Margaret. He didn't and Oppo's need to. He simply listened for years to people who trusted him with information they had no reason to protect. Everything else he compiled through Caleb and Oppo's reconnaissance. End quote. End quote. He didn't and Oppo's just want the money. End quote. End quote. No, end quote, Renee said. End quote. He wanted to watch you lose your daughter the way he lost his career. He wanted you to know you couldn't and Oppo's protect the one person who mattered most. The money was Caleb and Oppo's incentive. The destruction was Reyes and Oppo's end quote. I sat in the dark study a long while after we hung up. 15 years. Franklin Reyes had spent 15 years engineering a revenge so patient and so elaborate that it had taken a mislabeled spreadsheet on a laptop to stop it. Agent Doyle called at 6 the next morning. End quote. FBI agents executed a search warrant at Franklin Reyes and Oppo's residence in Lexington at 5:15 this morning. He was taken into custody without incident. His wife and Oppo's being interviewed separately. End quote. Her voice was steady and precise. End quote. He wrote a confession last night before we arrived. Judge Callaway left it on his kitchen table. Handwritten, 4 pages. End quote. End quote. What does it say? End quote. She read the relevant section. Reyes and Oppo's handwriting, she said, had been careful and deliberate. The penmanship of a man who and Oppo's signed judicial orders for 19 years. I hired Caleb Ferris to make Margaret Callaway feel the loss of everything she valued. The way I lost everything I built. She reported my conduct and destroyed my career. I wanted her to understand what that felt like. I wanted her to know that the things we build can be taken from us by people who believe they are righteous. I sat with that for a moment. End quote. What are the charges? End quote. End quote. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and abuse of judicial authority under the statutes that still apply to former officers of the court. End quote. A pause. End quote. He and oppose S74. His attorney will argue age as a mitigating factor, but the paper trail is clean and the confession is voluntary. He and oppose S going to federal prison, Margaret. End quote. I drove to Roanoke 2 days later and met Bethany Whitaker at a coffee shop near the courthouse where she now worked as a fraud attorney. She was already there when I arrived, sitting with her back to the wall, hands around a cup she had and oppose. Tea touched, the way people sit when they and oppose. We learned to keep the exits in view. I told her about Reyes, about the payments, about the confession, about Caleb and oppose S arrest and Dana Whitfield and oppose S processing and the charges moving through the federal system. She listened without speaking. When I finished, she looked down at her cup for a long moment, and a tear dropped onto the back of her hand, and she looked at it like it had surprised her. End quote. My father would have been 71 this year, end quote, she said quietly. End quote. He wanted a workshop with better light. He and oppose D been saving for new windows for 2 years before. End quote. She pressed her lips together. End quote. He never got the windows because Caleb Ferris needed money and Franklin Reyes needed revenge, and nobody thought about what it would cost a furniture restorer from a converted tobacco barn who just wanted good things for his daughter. End quote. End quote. I know, end quote, I said. End quote. And I am sorrier for that than I know how to say. End quote. She looked up. Her eyes were red, but her voice came out clear. End quote. Will you be at the sentencing? End quote. End quote. Every one of them, end quote. She nodded slowly, then said something I wasn't in oppose T prepared for. End quote. Thank you for not paying him off. Priya Sethna and oppose S father paid Caleb to disappear, and it sent him straight to your daughter. You didn't end oppose T do that. You built a case. You did it the right way. End quote. She exhaled. End quote. That matters. It really does. End quote. The legal outcomes came in through the late summer and fall, one after another, the way verdicts always do. Not all at once, but each one closing a door that had been standing open too long. Caleb Ferris received 16 years, wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, assault on a law enforcement officer. He stood at sentencing without expression, his eyes finding mine once across the courtroom and then moving away. I did not look away. Dana Whitfield received 7 years. Her attorney argued diminished agency, that Caleb had been the architect and she the instrument. The judge disagreed. She had drafted every document. She had known exactly what she was building and for whom. Franklin Reyes received 8 years, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, obstruction of justice, abuse of judicial authority. He was 74. And his attorney argued for leniency on grounds of age and prior service. The prosecutor read his own confession aloud. I wanted her to understand what that felt like, and the courtroom went very quiet. The judge sentenced him to 8 years and recommended no early release consideration for the first 5. Bethany Whitaker attended Caleb and oppose S sentencing, sitting 3 rows behind me, straight-backed, hands folded, the particular stillness of someone who and oppose S waited a long time for a specific moment and has decided to be fully present for it. When the sentence was read, I heard her exhale one long breath that carried 3 years of weight releasing all at once. Afterward, she found me in the courthouse hallway. End quote. My father would have been glad, end quote, she said steady and clear. End quote. Not happy, I Don and oppose T think he was a man who found happiness in anyone and oppose S punishment. Glad that it was named. That it was counted, end quote. She squeezed my hand with both of hers. End quote. Thank you, Margaret. End quote. Partial restitution from the seized accounts was awarded the right channel forward. She took 6 weeks away from the practice after the arrests. She walked the paddocks in the mornings. She started seeing a counselor in Lexington twice a week, someone she trusted, and called me most evenings, sometimes for an hour, sometimes just to hear a familiar voice for 10 minutes before she went to sleep. By late summer she was back at the practice part-time. By September full-time. In October, on an ordinary Tuesday with no particular occasion, she called me with something in her voice I recognized because I and Oppos D been listening for it for months, the same lightness she and Oppos D had the night she first told me about Nathaniel Cole. This time it was real. Unperformed. Hers. And quote, there and Oppos S someone I want to bring out to the farm and quote, she said. And quote, for dinner if that and Oppos S all right. His name is Grant Ellery. He and Oppos S the equine surgeon over at the Woodford practice, we and Oppos V worked cases together for 2 years actually, and I never really, and quote, she laughed at herself. And quote, he doesn't and Oppos T talk about himself much. Mostly he asks questions and then actually listens to the answers. And quote, I smiled into the phone. And quote, bring him Sunday. And quote, I called Renee the next morning out of old habit, and she called back that afternoon. Clean record. Stable career. Genuine references. A man who was exactly who he said he was, with a history that had been lived rather than constructed. Grant Ellery arrived that Sunday driving a truck with 140,000 honest miles on it, carrying a bottle of decent bourbon he and Oppos D clearly chosen without trying to impress anyone in particular, and he called me Dr. Calloway, my old faculty title from the years I and Oppos D taught a seminar at the law school, because Claire had mentioned it once and he and Oppos D remembered. He asked me about the Stallion syndication renewal, and then listened to the whole answer without once redirecting the conversation back to himself. He laughed at Claire and Oppos S jokes without trying to top them. When Hollis mentioned a mare with a complicated hock injury, Grant walked out to the barn before dessert to look at the x-rays himself, unasked, because it genuinely interested him. After lunch, Claire found me on the porch. She crossed the yard, climbed the steps, and slipped her arm through mine the way she had since she was tall enough to reach my elbow. And quote, I know you ran a background check, and quote, she said. And quote, old habits. And quote. She laughed, warm, real, surprised at itself, and then went quiet for a moment, watching Grant and Hollis lean over the paddock fence together, deep in conversation about a horse. And quote, do you think I and Oppos will ever stop doing the math? And quote, she asked. And quote, every time someone in Oppos S kind to me, some part of me runs the numbers now, checks the seams. And quote, I think that part of you is going to be with you for a while, and quote, I said honestly. And quote, I think it should be for a while. But it doesn't in Oppos T have to be the only voice in the room. You can run the numbers and let yourself have this. Your father wanted me to promise I and Oppos D keep watching even when it felt unkind to watch. He never once said watching had to replace loving. Just that it should stand beside it, and quote. She was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the paddock, the timber line going copper in the afternoon light, the fence line David used to walk on Sunday mornings thinking things through. And quote, do you think he knew it would be this bad? And quote, she asked. And quote, what we and Oppos D have to go through. And quote, no, and quote, I said. And quote, but he knew you and Oppos D need someone standing beside you when something like it came. And he knew I needed a reason to keep paying attention. And quote, I paused. And quote, he was right about both. And quote, that evening after Grant had driven back toward Woodford and Claire had gone up to bed, I walked the east fence line alone at sunset, the way I had every evening since I came home to this farm for good. The light turned the hills gold. The maras moved slow and easy through the paddock. I stopped at the corner post, the old one David used to touch with his hand when he turned to walk back toward the house, and closed my eyes and listened to the farm settle into evening, and heard him one last time, clear and certain and at peace. You kept your promises, Margaret. Both of them. Now rest. I opened my eyes. The light was fading over the timber line, turning the sky colors David never quite found the words for. I stood there until it was dark, and then I walked home. I am 66 years old, and I have learned more from this year of my life than from 31 years on the federal bench. The instinct that whispers when something feels wrong is not paranoia. It is information. gathered by a part of you that has been paying closer attention than the rest of you has given it credit for. I nearly talked myself out of listening to it more than once, because it felt unkind to distrust a man my daughter loved, and because loving someone is supposed to mean giving them the benefit of every doubt. I don and oppose. T believe that anymore, not entirely. I believe love and discernment are not opposites. They are partners. You can welcome someone into your family and still keep your eyes open. You can trust deeply and still verify carefully, and those two things do not cancel each other out, they hold each other up. I think too about how much of what nearly destroyed us came not from a stranger and oppose greed alone but from an old wound of my own, one I had made the right decision about and then simply set down and walked away from, assuming it was finished because the paperwork said it was. It wasn't, and oppose T finished. It had been waiting 15 years in a man who could not let go of what accountability had cost him. I don and oppose. T regret reporting what I reported. I would do it again. But I understand now that the truth once spoken doesn't and oppose. T always stay contained to the moment you speak it. Sometimes it travels a long way before it comes home. Mostly, though, I think about my daughter 20 feet away from a man who intended to take everything, holding a performance steady enough to save us both for 8 weeks without a single visible crack. And I think that whatever else this year cost us, it also proved something I will carry for the rest of my life, that the people we raise are very often braver than we ever gave them credit for being, and that the bravest thing any of us can do in the end is simply refuse to let someone destroy what we promised to protect.